never forgot, because he showed a self-effacement, a great modesty, an extraordinary kindness. There's a wonderful story of him being at Kennebunkport, and of course he had, as you were just talking about, a vast brood of grandchildren in addition to children. And he once spent, this is when he was president of the United States, 45 minutes at Kennebunkport trying to find the stuffed animal that was momentarily lost of one of his grandkids. That's the kind of person George Bush was.
All right, just want to point out, we just saw Vice President Mike Pence there, and among the crowd that's entering the service there on Capitol Hill. So, Kurt, how would you describe his style as an orator? Like, when you were trying to capture his voice in the speeches you wrote for him, what did you try to do?
Well, I tried to capture the silhouette of the man. He wanted prose that reflected him: Spartan, sparse, direct, honest, no flim-flam, not ornate. He told me once in our first speech meeting in the Oval Office the day after he was inaugurated, he looked at me and he looked at the other writers and said, "You know, I'd rather quote Yogi Berra than Thomas Jefferson." He meant it. And I found out, to my shame, that he knew more Yogi Berra-isms than I did. But that was what he was, and this is how he liked his speeches. He liked short sentences. He liked cultural references that were honest. He would not use anything, any joke, any reference that he didn't understand, because it wasn't honest to him. So I wound up giving him basically Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, because that's what he liked and what he knew, and I liked it too, because I had grown up with it, and his audiences loved it. So he was an incredibly honest and authentic person. What you saw is what you got. Mm-hmm. I mean, I found in politics that there is often a Grand Canyon of a gulf between what the average person sees and what staffers see. That was not true at all with the 41st president. There was no difference of any kind between what the American people saw and what we saw each day.
Well, it's wonderful to hear that, because when those two things align, that's when you know you've got a genuine leader. So, Kurt, you mentioned his love of baseball. I want to talk a little bit more about his athleticism, because people may not realize this, but, you know, he played baseball seriously all through Yale. He was captain of the Yale baseball team. How much, when he was president and you were still dealing with him, was he able to participate in any sorts of sports or athletics?
Well, he recreated with a capital R, and he was outside as much as he could with a capital O, because this was an extraordinarily vital, vigorous, and athletic man. He once told me that he had picked up a baseball bat for the first time at age 5, swung it, and said to himself, "Baseball has everything." And that was at 5. And at 94, he was still watching baseball, I am told, on television. So it was a lifetime love of his. But not simply baseball. Golf, horseshoes. He loved to drive his boat, the Fidelity, up at Kennebunkport. And I am told he drove fast.
Yeah,
He loved to fish. He loved to do basically any kind of outdoor activity that you could find. And it bonded him. I mean, I'll never forget in the 1992 election campaign, which didn't turn out too well for the president against Bill Clinton, but it turned out very well for the U.S. Summer Olympic team. And they came to the White House that August. And the president was, 71 by then, I think? But he was 11 in spirit. I'm telling you, he just enjoyed that because he was one of them. He was a former athlete talking to athletes, and he was forever young. That's what I'll remember about George Bush.
Incredible. I just want to point out that we're looking at pictures of all the attendees filing in to Capitol Hill, a veritable who's who of Washington, D.C. We saw an earlier picture of all the Supreme Court justices gathered there. And there, I believe, is President Carter, I think, standing there. He's a little far away, so I can't quite make it out for sure. No, I am mistaken. That is not President Carter. But simply almost anyone in Washington, D.C. right now is filing in to Capitol Hill. Kurt, back to your memories of George H.W. Bush. Would you say that he was comfortable as president? Did he feel at all conflicted about holding the highest office?
No, because I think that he was prepared, and he knew that he was prepared for the nation's highest office. You were talking to the great historian Larry Sabato earlier. This is a man whom I would suggest had very likely the greatest resume of any person ever to become president of the United States. He'd been a war hero. He knew and did not take lightly sending men into war. He had then become a business entrepreneur. He had packed up his belongings, he and Mrs. Bush and their young son, George W., and they packed it all in a red Studebaker, and they'd gone from Connecticut to Texas, and he'd made a fortune.
Yeah.
He was an oil wildcatter in the terminology of the 1950s. And he was accepted by Texans, and he accepted them. He loved the state of Texas, and so did Mrs. Bush. And the reciprocal was true as well. He became just an icon of the Lone Star State. Again, the lack of pretense, no presumption of any kind, and you know, he simply was very equipped, and then he went in from there to the Congress, ran unsuccessfully for the Senate. President Nixon appointed him the United Nations ambassador, which began his extraordinary foreign policy expertise. Then, of course, the CIA. In between, he had a political task as director of the Republican National Committee, but as well as he became the first liaison of the United States to the People's Republic of China. You could not be better prepared to understand America's role in the world and its place in that world than was George H.W. Bush.
Yeah, Larry, if you're still with us, I want to talk a little bit about the extraordinary number of roles, George H.W. Bush played in his life. He seemed to have so many talents, and he succeeded in so many fields, in business, in his military career, in his political career. Do you think he was a person who set goals for himself from the outset? Do you think he said to himself, I want to be president someday, and here's the way to do it? Or he set sort of mini goals. First, I want to make my fortune. I want to serve my country. I want to make my fortune. I want to become president. How do you think he managed to accomplish all that he did?
He kept focused on whatever his goal was at the moment. Now, it's certainly true that a fair number of our presidents were whistling "Hail to the Chief," even as children.
Right.
So I'm sure he had some ambition. His father was a U.S. senator. He saw presidents. But Kurt just made a very interesting observation. If you do measure the number of really important jobs that he had, he might well have been the best prepared president, maybe except for Thomas Jefferson. I do have to defend the founder of my university, so maybe it was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and George H.W. Bush. But it is remarkable how many of these experiences he had. Why did he have them? Because he instilled confidence in people that he could carry out an agenda, do it well, accomplish the important goals, and also do some of it privately. Maybe his mother really did inculcate those values. He didn't need to boast about everything. Everybody didn't have to know about everything.
Right. I just want to point out that we're watching members of Congress filing in. Nancy Pelosi, we saw her earlier, and we're looking at a live picture of the motorcade accompanying President George H.W. Bush's hearse on its way to Capitol Hill. Clearly, this is a moment and a day that has been planned to the T, every second accounted for. Even that new D.C. traffic, which, of course, this motorcade is not encountering, but they seem to be right on schedule, if not ahead of schedule. Larry, going back to the Bush family dynasty, so much of the backbone of this family was Barbara Bush. In another era, would she have been the politician?
That's a great question. If we could go 50 years into the future, I wouldn't be surprised at all, or maybe both of them would be politicians. After all, it happened with Bill and Hillary Clinton.
That's right.
They both were senior politicians. So, I also have to say Barbara Bush had very good political judgment. She's the one who counseled Jeb Bush not to run for president, that 3 Bushes as president was probably one too many. And she was right. She was absolutely right.
Yeah, she She never put a wrong foot forward. She just had a nose for politics and a nose for the right thing to do. And we are going to go now to the CBS News Network special report.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Jeff Glor, reporting from the U.S. Capitol tonight. The motorcade carrying the body of George H.W. Bush is arriving here at this hour. As you see, following a ceremony that will begin shortly, the 41st president will lie in state in the Capitol.